All right, so we should be live now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of What's the Tea here at ANU, Building Beyond Violence and Abuse. My name is Celeste Angulo. Some of you may be familiar with me because I've done multiple of these episodes here, but I do have the pleasure of having two very special guests with us today. We're going to be talking about the intersection between domestic violence and brain injury, which is a very special, very necessary topic to talk about. And also very interesting. I had the pleasure of watching a training by these ladies, and very interesting information that's going to be shared with you all today. Definitely very necessary and needed. So I have with me Dr. Dorothy Kozlowski, who is a professor of Neuroscience and Biology at DePaul University, as well as the co-founder and director of the Illinois Coalition to Address Intimate Partner Violence-Induced Brain Injury. I also have Dr. Sonya Crabtree-Nelson, associate professor in the Department of Social Work at DePaul University. So thank you, ladies, for being here. Anything you want to share about yourself, you can feel free to share. I know I've introduced, but anything else you want to add to that? If you want to go first, Dorothy.
No, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I guess the only thing that I'll add is that this field and this intersection between domestic violence and brain injury is not something that I was knowledgeable about a while ago. And so it was really great to make a connection with Sonya and to learn more about how this intersection can occur. And we're really excited to be chatting with you all today.
Absolutely. And I will add that even though prior to working in academia, I did work in the field of domestic violence, but I say in all of our trainings that prior to my connection with Dorothy, I had not put the pieces together to be thinking about the fact that so many survivors of IPV were most likely also struggling with brain injury. So it's been a great partnership for me as well.
Hey, so let's go ahead and get into today's very interesting topic that after watching the training, I am now very interested in as well. So let's talk about what the brain kind of looks like, which I know can be difficult to explain verbally, but what does the brain look like and what kinds of things can actually injure the brain?
Sure. Well, I think this is where having a visual or two might help. So let me share my screen here. Okay, can you see this image here?
Yes.
Okay, so the brain itself, as you can see a picture of here, is really basically a bunch of fat. And it is encased in your skull, which of course is hard. And it has these bony intersections inside of it, which when your brain is jostled around in there, it can cause some definite serious damage. So this is just a general picture of what the brain looks like. But if you really think of like, a bowl of Jell-O, that's sort of the consistency of what the brain is. And when we talk about brain injury, a lot of people initially think that brain injury just means getting hit in the head. And that is one type of brain injury. But when we talk about brain injury in the context of IPV, intimate partner violence, there's two different kinds of brain injury to consider. One is traumatic brain injury, and I've got my little video here to show you. So, right, this is your skull and your brain as Jell-O jostling around in it. This is kind of a visual of what happens if, excuse me, someone hits your head, right, or your head hits an object. And if that occurs, and that can occur, of course, in the context of domestic violence, that is thought of as a traumatic brain injury. And then the other type of brain injury that we don't always think of as a brain injury is strangulation. And what happens with strangulation, here is a picture of your body, and the red and bluish purple are all of your blood vessels, right? So in your neck here, you've got some really significant blood vessels that go to your brain. And blood is really, really important for your brain because it provides it with oxygen and nutrients. And so when someone is strangled, the passage in the neck, of course, is constricted and the flow of blood is constricted. And that basically, even for a short amount of time, can cause some brain injury to occur. So when we talk about brain injury, when Sonya and I talk about it here, we're going to be talking about brain injury as it can happen either through a traumatic event or through strangulation.
Right. And that's very interesting that when I hear that the brain is kind of like Jello, the first thing I think of is fragile, right? Jello is very fragile. It can tear, tear into pieces and break. So that's something that you have to be very careful with, which is basically why I think, it seems like our skull is protecting our brain. But yeah, any type of trauma can definitely lead to brain injury. But I like that you're also talking about strangulation, because oftentimes a lot of us don't think or don't understand or aren't aware that strangulation can also lead to brain injury. And even if it's for a short amount of time, like you said, it really can be, damaged. So let's talk about brain injury and its forms. So can you explain some of the different forms of brain injury, if you have anything to add to that?
I not necessarily forms, but people can use a lot of different terms when they talk about brain injury. So you can hear of traumatic brain injury, or TBI, or concussion, or a coma. A lot of these things can refer to traumatic brain injury itself. And then the type of brain injury that happens if you are strangled and there's a lack of oxygen to the brain has a pretty technical term. It's called hypoxic ischemic brain injury. All that means is hypoxia means your brain isn't getting enough oxygen, and ischemia means you're not getting enough blood. So you may hear a lot of these terms, but collectively they all mean your brain has been injured in some way.
Okay. Different forms. So what kind of symptoms can actually result from brain injury? In your training, you talked about the broken circuits in the brain that can actually be recovered, but it really depends on the amount of time of the strangulation, or it depends on a lot of different factors, right? But what kind of symptoms can result from this?
Yeah, so maybe before I jump into symptoms, I can show you just this picture here. So this is a picture of our brain if we kind of looked at it from the inside here, cutting it in half. And if you see all these purple lines and purple pathways, we like to think of our brain as being organized into circuits. You can think of electrical circuits, or I like to think of it as highways. So if you think about all the pathways we take to get to work, to get to school, to get to home, etc., all of these pathways here are sort of depicted here in purple on the brain. And just like all of our pathways, all of our routes that we take get us to a specific destination, each of these circuits in the brain are responsible for a different kind of behavior. So this little circuit here might be responsible for thinking clearly. This one up here might be responsible for moving properly. And so if during brain injury, what happens is, depending on the type of brain injury, how it happens, etc., some of these circuits start to get broken, or they're not functioning properly. And you can almost think of them as these little X's, these little roadblocks, these little potholes, or, a road closure. So if you're trying to get from home to school or home to work, and there's an accident on the road, or there's a pothole on the road, that makes it harder or slower to get from point A to point B. So when we talk about our healthy brain, we think that our brain is kind of wired for thought, how all these different circuits, there's trillions of them, to be honest, they all work in a really organized way to help us do all the things we do. Any sort of alteration to that, making them work a little slower or blocking them all together, can result, which happens after a brain injury, can result in these broken circuits. And that gets us to your initial question, which is, well, what are the symptoms? And this is where it gets tricky, because a lot of these symptoms that occur depend on where the circuits are broken, right? And it's not the same each time. Each brain injury can be very different, and it can be different from any one person to the other. So there's a very long list of symptoms, but in a nutshell, they can be things like headaches, nausea, blurry vision, trouble with light sensitivity, trouble with sound, being really sensitive to sound, having trouble sleeping or not sleeping enough or too much, and then problems with concentration, with memory, feeling foggy, and then lastly, your emotional, your mental health, being more emotional or irritable or depressed or anxious. Now, you may think, well, that's a lot of symptoms. How are these really specific to brain injury, right? Because they could be the symptoms from a lot of different things that are going on in people's lives. We've experienced these symptoms before, right? But we like to think that if someone's experienced a violent episode that involved hits to the head or strangulation, and any of these symptoms all of a sudden happened after that, or within a short period of time after, or whether a previous symptom's gotten significantly worse after a violent episodes, those can very well likely be a symptom of brain injury.
Okay. That's exactly what I was thinking. Like maybe I've had a brain injury because I feel like I've experienced all of these symptoms, but that's a good way to look at it if they have been directly after. This isn't a question kind of prompted for, but I wonder if something like this can be seen through a CAT scan. Like, can you get an X-ray and see whether there's been damage to the brain?
Yeah, that's where it's tricky, right? Because
Yeah.
let's say you go to the emergency room and you actually volunteer that, I've been hit in the head and I've have these symptoms. They will send you for a CAT scan probably. And unfortunately, all that a CAT scan can show is whether there's some bleeding in the brain or there's some loss of tissue in your brain. And a lot of the brain injuries, unless they're very, very severe, don't necessarily show up that way in a CAT scan. They're much more subtle and harder to see in the kind of brain imaging that we have available in hospitals right now.
Okay, makes sense. So let's talk about treatments. How can these symptoms be treated, or can they be treated?
Yeah, well, there's a good and bad news to this, right? The good news, well, let's start with the bad news. The bad news is there's not a magic pill to treat traumatic brain injury. There are some things that some diseases that, yes, here's a pill, you can take this and this disease or this issue will go away. That's not the case with traumatic brain injury. With brain injury, you're treating symptoms. And fortunately, all of these symptoms that I've just presented to you, they all have something that can be done to treat it, either through medicine or through lifestyle, et cetera. So there's medications for headaches and mental health issues and such. And then you can also do different types of therapies. So physical therapy for your balance or trouble moving. You can do speech and cognitive therapies for trouble remembering, or occupational therapy for like getting your life organized. And then also there's psychological therapy that you can get for your mood disruptions and behavioral health. The tricky part is that it's not a one-stop shop, right? It's complicated, and each person has their own series of symptoms, and it's hard, right? It's hard to take care of this symptom with this doctor or this pharmacist, and then go to that therapist for that symptom and another therapist for another symptom. So treating traumatic brain injury can be tricky and requires someone to be quite organized in terms of keeping track of all the things they should be doing to get better.
All right, so I hear medication, there's possible medications, therapy, even changing your lifestyle. What about when these injuries are repeated?
So we've heard a lot about repeat concussions, perhaps in professional sports like football and hockey. In those cases, there's a pretty strong link now between repeated hits to the head and worsening of symptoms, and also potentially a disorder called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, also known as CTE. previously used to be called punch drunk syndrome because it used to see it in boxers. And these repeated hits to the head, and we haven't really done a lot of examination of this, but I'm going to be assuming that also repeated strangulations. It's not healthy to have repeated bouts of hypoxic ischemic kind of brain injury. But in terms of traumatic brain injury, we have already seen in a few case studies that there have been autopsies on survivors of domestic violence who are showing signs in their brains of CTE, which was previously mainly thought to be occurring primarily in professional athletes or even the military. So there's a lot more to learn about this, but I think that the care that we're starting to give professional athletes about you shouldn't have multiple hits to the head is something that needs to also start happening in the context of intimate partner violence as well.
Wow. So that's actually my next topic. I wanted to bring up kind of the intersection between intimate partner violence or domestic violence and brain injury. So how could intimate partner violence result in brain injury?
Great question. So what we know, like, and many of your viewers here probably know these stats, but I want to start by saying we do know that domestic violence, IPV, is quite prevalent, even though as a society we still don't like to talk about it very much. But the recent stats from the CDC say approximately 1 in 4 women experience IPV in their lifetime. And we know, the stats for men in IPV approximately, although it varies a lot, 1 in 6. And then also in the transgender, gender expansive community, the rates are even higher, about 54% of the population. So when we look at those numbers, we know that domestic violence is very prevalent. What we also know is that up to 92% of survivors of domestic violence receive facial or head injuries during violent episodes. And those numbers are probably underreported based on what we know about people reporting their experiences. So if we just look at those stats, we're looking at approximately 27 million women who may be showing signs or symptoms of brain injury based on the fact that so many are saying they have received, blows to the head or injuries to the neck or head. So lots of times, I know in our work, we've been talking about it being more of a diagnosis of exclusion, that it's, we're going to assume that, like Dorothy said, if someone has had some type of blow to the head, has been strangled, and have seen any of these symptoms occur or worsen, that we're going to assume there may be a brain injury. So it's startling. And to add one more stat onto there, that we really know the prevalence of brain injury in the context of domestic violence is estimated to be at 11 to 12 times greater than the incidence of brain injury from occupational, recreational, and accident events. So it's startling and needs more conversation, just like conversations have happened for other folks and, athletes, military. We need to be having those conversations for survivors.
Wow, that's very eye-opening. I actually, when I took the training, I noted that down because I thought that data was very eye-opening. That shows that the prevalence of brain injury in the context of IPV is about 11 to 12 times higher. That's incredible.
It is.
I also like that you mentioned that it's probably underreported, right? Because already it's a really high percentage, but we know that most people don't report domestic violence. Most people don't report this type of abuse. So it must be even higher.
Absolutely. And we know those that do report often really downplay the severity of what has occurred due to so many reasons. One, of course, being shame and not wanting to be judged by others. Absolutely.
Definitely. So another thing I learned from the training is that women and children are at higher risk. And And this makes sense because women are at higher risk of domestic violence, of being victimized in a domestic violence situation. Anything you want to speak on that, on why women and children are at higher risk for a brain injury?
Well, one of the things is that we actually don't have stats on men who have, potentially received brain injury due to IPV, and we don't have it yet on the LGBTQ community. So much of that is information that we still need to learn, and we could discover that the prevalence is extremely high there as well. But thus far, there's very, as you know from our training, there's very limited research that's been done on this intersection, and the research that has been done on women.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly where I was going with that. That's exactly what direction I wanted to go in, because there's definitely more need for more research here, but we're in the right direction and we're learning more as we go. And so in what ways might brain injury impact like violence? So for example, maybe getting access to services or ability to make their own decisions, or even the police's interpretation. How can it impact the domestic violence survivor?
Such a great point to bring up, Celeste. And I think once we think about all those symptoms that Dorothy mentioned earlier, we can just, imagine that this is impacting everything in someone's life. So I think one of the ones that was most startling to me to really have dawned on me was thinking about so much judgment that currently occurs when we think about police officers and first responders responding to a domestic call. And lots of times people say, oh, well, she changed her mind, or her story wasn't linear, her story changed, throughout the course of 10 minutes, or she seemed out of it. Maybe she was on substances, And when we pause and think about what we now know about all the symptoms of brain injury, we can think, yeah, her vision may be blurry. We know that her thinking might not be clear. She might be confused. She might be having trouble sort of tracking a linear timeline of events. And so this is going to come across negatively to those first responders unless they are trained to be thinking, oh, perhaps a brain injury is occurring here. So I'm going to change my expectations and even change the way I'm asking some of these questions. And so, of course, that impacts other things too. Dorothy was mentioning how to follow up. Let's say someone even wants to connect with services, and so they need numerous services to help them heal from their brain injury, to help relieve those symptoms. But it's going to be very hard to think about following through with all those different appointments, remembering the dates, getting that all straight. And even just for many folks, especially in our urban Chicago environment, thinking about getting to appointments, getting childcare so that they can do that, possibly taking, a train and several buses to get to different medical appointments. So it's a lot, and it's going to impact all those areas. And so it's helpful, right? It's helpful to do these kind of trainings so that we can know and know what to expect and how to help.
Definitely. I think it's really important to just understand that, aside from injury, or brain injury, everyone has their own situation, and everyone who is suffering from domestic violence is living with their own situations that impact it in so many different ways. So not everyone has the same situation here. Everyone's different. And that's something that's really important, especially when helping people impacted by domestic violence. So let's talk about, we did talk a little bit about how brain injury is diagnosed. As we talked about how most people are actually unaware that they have a brain injury. So if you have anything to add to that on how brain injury can be diagnosed, are there any specific tools, anything of that sort?
Sure. And Dorothy, I don't know if you want to throw this on since you have been sharing, but historically there when we started working together, I learned about the HELPS tool, which is an older tool that different folks, it's not an imaging, it's a, checklist, but it's not very popular, and it's not the one that we are currently recommending. Instead, our partners in Ohio have come up with a tool called the CHATS tool. And Dorothy is pulling that up now. So this is the one that we've been recommending and helping distribute to different providers in Chicago area. And it's more straightforward and simplistic in a way, which I think is helpful. But, asking simple questions. Has anyone ever put their hands around your neck, put something over your mouth, done anything that made you feel choked? Have you been hit or hurt in the head? If you were hurt, did you ever feel dazed, confused, dizzy? Are you having trouble with any of these different things below? So thinking that someone who's just suffered a brain injury might have a difficult time processing, even our partners created something that was very straightforward and tested this throughout the state of Ohio. And it's been met with really, really good reception. So right now, this is the tool that we are recommending to use.
Okay, so I wonder if this is being used with doctors and therapists.
That's a great question. I don't believe it's being used by medical personnel.
Okay.
Currently. So it's been more in the domestic violence agency realm that it's being utilized.
Makes sense. All right, so let's dive into the coalition. Let's talk about the Illinois Coalition to Address Intimate Partner Violence-Induced Brain Injury. So if you want to explain a little bit about the coalition and its goals. Anything you'd like to share?
Sure. Yes, it's been a few years now that Dorothy, Kate Lawler from Swedish Hospital, and myself co-founded the Illinois Coalition to Address Intimate Partner Violence-Induced Brain Injury. And Dorothy has been at the forefront of sort of helping develop our website. So we do encourage any of you to check it out for more information. We have information there for folks who are doing the work, for folks who may have or been curious if they have sustained a brain injury. We have information about our coalition, but also some different connections to resources for survivors and practitioners as well. With our coalition, we basically are saying that there are 4 main pillars that we are tackling. Those are education, research, services, and advocacy. So to tell you a little bit about the education piece, which of course, in many ways, this falls under today, is really getting the information out about this intersection. So once again, thank you for inviting us today. So we're wanting to educate folks doing the work. We're wanting to educate healthcare providers. We're wanting to educate the public, right? Lots of times it's family and friends who might be the first ones to think about this and connect their survivors with additional resources. Also coming from the field of domestic violence, I'm a big believer that knowledge creates options, which can, create a sense of power for survivors. And so I do believe in also giving them the information so they can help make decisions about their life. Like Dorothy talked about, repeat concussions, repeat brain injury is extremely serious. And so we want them to have the information about what could potentially be occurring with blows to the head and strangulation. We're also working on different printed materials to distribute for DV agencies, hospitals, survivors as well. We are academics, so research is also one of our prongs. Back in 2019, Dorothy, I, and a colleague, Dr. Johnny Lifshitz, and we all helped guest edit a 2-volume journal, a special episode of a journal, Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma, with the focus really on brain injury and IPV. So once again, that is linked on our website if you want to check some of that out. In addition, we are in the midst of 2 different research projects. One is a partnership with Swedish Hospital looking at rates of potential brain injury in survivors of IPV who utilize the emergency department, both prior to the pandemic and during pandemic. And then we are also just wrapping up a project where we were providing trainings and then also doing focus groups with area domestic violence agencies to learn more about what is currently known and is being done in relation to survivors with potential brain injury, and what we can do to sort of help move better service access and more prolific services forward in the Chicagoland area.
Wow, that's amazing to hear. It sounds like the coalition is doing so much. There's so much research being done, and there's so much to do, right? So I hear education, research, services, advocacy, all of your goals there. You can also, if you'd like to send me those links, we can share those in the comments. If anyone is interested in looking that up, we'll also be sharing the link for your training that you provide on your website. So I'll also share that in the comments if anyone's interested in looking or taking that training. You can take it at your own time. I took it at my own time. It was very interesting to watch. But let's talk about how we can help somebody. So how can we help? How can we accommodate someone who has experienced brain injury due to domestic violence?
Absolutely. Dorothy, had you wanted to hop in at all on the, no?
Well, I was just going to add, but this kind of rolls into the next question that you're going to address here, Sonya, is that the other 2 components of our coalition are services and advocacy. And services directly goes to the question, Celeste, that you just asked. So I'll let Sonya talk about what we're trying to do to help provide more services to survivors who may be experiencing brain injury symptoms. So I'll let Sonya take that.
Excellent. So it's multi-pronged in that we are, like I said, talking with providers, those working at domestic violence agencies, and then we're also talking with folks who are working in the healthcare system, because I think it's really important, right, that we're addressing things in both areas. So thinking about, how to work with someone, what we need to know, some of the things that we talk about in our trainings with service providers is even just thinking about what we know about the symptoms that someone might be experiencing, and then thinking about how that translates to what a survivor might need when she's coming to access shelter, when she's coming to access counseling, when she's accessing legal advocacy. So we talk with folks about, even simple things like thinking about, dimming the lights. So often we work in these spaces with these bright, fluorescent lights. If someone's had a brain injury, that's going to be really challenging to focus if that's the case. As much as we can limit distractions, that's important. Having a quieter room without loud noises, keeping our conversations, even for intakes, shorter. Sometimes we'll be slogging through, an hour's worth of paperwork, and that can just be too much. Knowing that we're going to have to probably read those questions for someone instead of expecting someone with brain injury to be reading through forms and filling them in. We can ask those questions and do that in a very clear, easy to understand way, not running through a lot of questions at once and then being surprised when someone doesn't know how to answer us correctly. being concrete in our instructions. If it's safe to write down or have the survivor write down information for follow-up steps, doing that. And then I think being sure that we make sure we follow up as well, not just think, okay, I gave someone a list of 5 things to do and expecting that they're going to be able to follow up with all that and remember it, but for us to follow up and see how we can help. And then, of course, we've done some, Dorothy especially, some trainings with hospitals, but there's a lot more that needs to be done there. As you can imagine, there's so many additional layers of folks in the different departments as well, thinking about how they have time in the midst of a crisis, especially in an emergency department, to assess for IPV and assess for potential brain injury, and how that can be done in a very survivor-centered way. So we've been working a lot with our partners at Pathways, which are housed at Swedish Hospital, who have done a lot around training the hospital personnel there. And in fact, we've been in conversations with other folks from area hospitals who are even interested in sort of borrowing some of that knowledge that the folks at Pathways have come up with over their years of doing this. We also have plans to do trainings with the courts, with first responders. All those things are still in the works.
Wow. That's a lot what you all are doing, and I think it's definitely very necessary, right? Training everyone, first responders, hospital staff. That's something that we've tried to do as well, which I think is really important, because sometimes these people are the very first people who they encounter. And that could, not being appropriately trained can actually lead to even more trauma. So we really have to be careful with those types of things, and the more education and trainings, the better it is for the survivors. So we are approaching I believe this is the last, we only have about 1 question left. So for the viewers, I just want to remind everybody that if anybody has any questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll have some time right at the end to answer any questions that you all may have. Even after the video, you can still post your questions and we will get back to them, and I'll make sure that those questions are answered for you. But those were really good tips on working with someone who has a possible brain injury. Any other resources that you want to share for someone who maybe believes that they have a brain injury, whether it's due to domestic violence or any other situation?
Yeah, I can, I'm going to direct you to our website. So we have a section here for anyone really who's interested to learn about brain injury. So we have sections here to talk about what is a brain injury, what are the symptoms, treatment, and then local clinics and providers. Many of these do focus on sports concussion, but Pathways is in here as well. So we do have these resources on our website. We also have a section here called resources. And if you are someone who would like to speak to someone about your own brain injury, we have resources here for you can actually talk to someone at the Brain Injury Association of Illinois. They are one of our partners of the coalition. And there's also a Concussion Legacy Foundation helpline. It's not immediate, but you can fill out a request form and schedule time to talk to someone there. And then also on this website, there are links to resources for survivors themselves, for family and friends of survivors, and then service providers, those folks who work with survivors. Lots of different links here as well. And then lastly, we do have a section here in resources. We have separate sections on videos that you referred to, Celeste, where this is where you can go through the whole training just like you did. And we also have a section that I'm building out a little bit more of, but we have educational materials. So that chats tool will be here in a minute, but we have these head injury education cards that in both English and in Spanish that will kind of talk through for a survivor what they might be looking for to see if they maybe are experiencing symptoms of head injury, et cetera. So there's a lot of resources on our website as well.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. We're also going to share the link. As mentioned before, we're going to share the links to this website in the comments. I think it's a really great resource to have. Definitely. So can we check if there are any comments or any questions in the comments, Rachel? Can you check for us?
Yeah, we have 3 right now.
Hey.
All right,
Okay.
the first one we will go with is regarding the number of brain injuries, the numbers of brain injuries and IPV, how are they reported and how will male and LGBTQIA plus communities be counted in the future?
Well, that's where the problem is that they're not reported. So there is a method by which the number of instances of IPV can be reported through the Centers for Disease Control. And there's also a separate section on the reporting of brain injury. Unfortunately, there's not any place where someone can report the intersection of the two. That is something that, as part of our advocacy, we're trying to get that addressed and making some connections there. So a lot of the data that we have on this intersection really comes from research. It comes from working with hospital systems, working with emergency rooms, working with departments of public health to try and tease through data that we have about people to see if there is an intersection itself. So in the future, that is something that we hope we'll be able to get more readily from, something like the CDC, for example.
That was a really great question.
Okay, thank you so much. Here's the next question. Have you seen a relationship or increase in brain injuries when it comes to pregnant females?
Sonya, do you want to take that, or there's some new data out
Go
that
ahead.
is
Yeah.
scary. And I'm not going to quote the numbers because I don't want to misquote it. But there is definitely a very high prevalence of IPV in women who are pregnant. And unfortunately, what we don't have a good understanding of is how that may then impact the fetus and the infant moving forward. But that is definitely a staggering number. And like I said, I don't want to quote the number because I don't want to quote it wrong. But when I initially saw it, I was quite shocked. Sonya, maybe you remember the stat on that.
I'm not remembering the stat either, and was hoping your brain did. Mine did not. But no, I remember, sort of recently hearing from some colleagues that it was, concerning sort of what the findings were related to this, and even sort of, potential for injury to the fetus, I think was, if I'm remembering correctly, was higher than people originally thought. So it was startling. I'll have to relook at that journal.
Well, that I think makes sense because even domestic violence itself is more common amongst pregnant women. So it definitely makes sense.
Thank you. And then final questions, more switching gears about the actual coalition. Can you speak a little bit more about the coalition? What is it comprised of? Who is it comprised of? And can a community member join or contribute?
Yes, we are, as Dorothy always says, we are not an exclusive club. Our strength is in numbers. Our strength is in all the interested folks who want to connect. We hold meetings via Zoom approximately every other month, and we encourage anyone interested to come, even if it's one time. Just because you come once does not mean you have to come again if you are busy or not able to. but absolutely come and check us out. A big thing initially was just wanting to connect with others who were working with survivors and or working with brain injury, and bring people together to see how we could best address this issue in the state of Illinois. Because, several years back, nothing was really being done to take this on. So the more people we connect with, the more we're thinking about things that perhaps Dorothy and I wouldn't think of on our own. So as you can see, we have folks who are in the legal field. We have folks who specialize in brain injury. We have folks who are, specializing in working with survivors. So it's a wonderful cross section of people. At times we bring in different speakers from some of our colleagues out of state to even talk with our group about, things that they currently are doing, so that we can see if we can take any parts of that to better our work here in Illinois. Sometimes folks within the coalition will, talk a little bit more about something they feel we could benefit from as a group. So we might learn about advocacy events related to this topic. We might learn more about service delivery. Yeah, so please don't hesitate to join us.
And I put this in the chat, Celeste and Richard, so I'm not sure if feel free to share this with the rest of the group, but I put my email there. And if you're interested in joining the coalition, or you don't have to sign in blood or anything, I mean, you can come and, come to a meeting and see what we do and see what we talk about. And I'd be happy to put you on the mailing list.
Yes, so we'll definitely share that in the comments. So the email address that you all can reach out to if you're interested in either joining or just checking out this coalition, the email address will be in the comments. Thank you all for sharing. It sounds like a really interesting coalition. And I like that you mentioned that, you don't have to completely sign up and attend to every meeting, because sometimes we are a little hesitant. We don't know if we have the time for it, or we're going to be able to fit it in our schedule. So that's really good as well. Any other, I know there were three, go ahead. No, I know there were three questions, Rachel. Any other questions so far?
That was it. Really, really good questions today.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Okay. So do we have anything else we want to add before we sum it up here? Any final thoughts? Anything at all? We did cover a lot.
We did. And just want to reiterate, yes, that please, for anyone to reach out to Dorothy or myself with any other questions, either related just to, specifics of what we were discussing or what's happening in the area, ways to get involved. Don't hesitate to reach out.
No, and I'd like to just thank Celeste and you for giving us this opportunity to talk about this. When we first started getting our thoughts together around this issue, there were so many people that indicated they never even thought of this issue. But as we do more of these interactions and trainings, it's really great to hear that more people are aware. And, as Sonya mentioned before, knowledge is power. And even though we may not have all the answers, and we may not have all the services that, of course, someone would need with this issue, at least knowing that this is something that may be going on can in and of itself be helpful. And we hope that the resources we've provided you all can be helpful as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, ladies. I could not have said it better. I want to thank you for being here and for helping us raise awareness to this issue and helping us try and end domestic violence and help domestic violence survivors in any way possible. So thank you so much for being here today and for providing this information. And feel free to click on the links in the comments and watch the training yourself. So thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.